Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I want to welcome you to another one of our colleague circles. We are really pleased to have with us today a bunch of folks from Connecticut Humanities who are going to be talking about a couple of things, updates related to their granting program, some new and up and coming grant lines, and the revised funding priorities for their granting program. With us today, we have Scott Wands, who many of you know. He's the manager of grants and programs at Connecticut Humanities, and Lian Partridge, who is the new grants and programs assistant at Connecticut Humanities. Also pleased to have with us Jason Mancini, who's Connecticut Humanities executive director, and Frank Mitchell, who's a Connecticut Humanities board member. Try to say Connecticut Humanities 15 times quickly. That's my challenge to all of you. Seeming to have done that at least 4 times without totally embarrassing myself, I'm going to hand things over to Scott. What they're going to lay out is basically going to take probably about 40 minutes, and we're hoping to have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you have any questions as we go, as always, you can pop them in the chat, and I will be monitoring that and can queue up questions for our presenters after they've finished sharing what they want to share. We can also do a live Q&A after they have finished speaking. If you have any questions as we go, please just pop them in the chat, or you can direct message me or raise your hand, and we will get going. So thanks for being here today, and I'm going to hand things over to Scott Wands. Scott.
Amherst, thank you so much. And thank you and to the Connecticut League for hosting us with today's colleague circle. You guys have been fabulous about connecting us with the state's communities as our grant lines have been coming out over the course of the pandemic. So it's much appreciated. Want to do a few different things today. We've had a number of different exciting updates from introducing Leanne, and we'll introduce her in a second and turn things over to her, to talking about our new funding priorities that were just approved by the board in August and went into effect at the beginning of September. And those are for our core project grant lines that we have been offering for a number of years, from quick grants to planning and implementation. But we also have some new exciting funds that we're going to be distributing over the coming weeks, and wanted to give you what's to come there, both in terms of operating support funding that will be coming from our funds from the state of Connecticut that we're offering in partnership with the Office of the Arts and the Department of Economic and Community Development, as well as NEH funds that we'll be distributing as part of the American Recovery Plan, and we're calling those SHARP grants. But we do want to leave ample time at the end, as Amherst said, for questions. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Lian Partridge to you all, and we'll turn things over to her in just a second. As many of you know who have been doing grants with us for a while, our granting department has had people that have come and gone over time. We've had as many as 3 people in the department, and I've been kind of solely manning the granting department for too long. So very excited to have Leanne join us. She interviewed with us over the summer, started, I think, August 16th was your first day. So we've officially hit month 2 now. She's doing great work. I know some of you have had the opportunity to meet with her, but I'm very excited to introduce her to you all now, and I will kind of roll out of the way and have her roll up here.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Leanne, and just a little bit about my background. I have a BA in literature with a double minor in film studies and Chinese language and culture. And I also have an MA in teaching English to speakers of other languages. So I've worked in a couple different institutions in film and in language programs, mostly in admin roles and also in teaching roles. And most recently, I was teaching ESL in China in a language and intercultural communication course. I'm really excited to be joining Connecticut Humanities. I'm really excited to be meeting all of you and hearing about all of the great work that's going around in Connecticut.
Thank you, Leanne, as I roll back in here. So I know some of you have done grant consults with us. She's been helping to get to know the projects that are coming in for the October quick grant deadline. She's also helping us work on some final reports now, so you might have gotten some emails from Leanne. And over the coming weeks, if you haven't had an opportunity to meet her with a phone call or video chat, or the rare in-persons that we're doing these days in the pandemic, look forward to having her meet you all those ways as well. Next up, I want to kind of move into the funding priorities here. And as I said, the funding priorities really overarch the different grant lines that we have for our core grant lines that we offer. And to kind of kick things off there, I want to pass the baton to Jason to talk about what's been going on at Connecticut Humanities in terms of strategic planning and strategic initiatives for the organization, which has led into the revision of the funding priorities that Frank Mitchell will tell you a little bit more about.
Thanks, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and thank you, Amherst and CLHO, for hosting this. We've recently undergone a new strategic planning initiative that was approved by our board last year. So we've spent quite a bit of time reimagining our role and reinforcing our role as sort of a statewide funding organization with a number of priorities now in the arena of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. We're building partnerships with other organizations so that we can have as big an impact on the state and our residents as possible, thinking big and collaboratively with our partner organizations in the Office of the Arts. I'm particularly excited because of all of this new energy and the advocacy work we've been doing at Connecticut Humanities and through many of you who have been reaching out to your legislators and a lot of the energy towards arts, culture, and tourism. Connecticut Humanities this past late June, was awarded nearly $31 million in the state's budget, through which we will partner with the Office of the Arts to provide a number of things. One, operating support to organizations as we're sort of imagining our collective futures. So also be aimed at IT and digital infrastructure, as well as ways in which we can all work towards better connecting our organizations with K-12 educators and students. Those are centering this funding and the reason we were awarded this funding. So we're estimating that, in the neighborhood of 700 arts and cultural organizations across the state will benefit from this funding. So this is your opportunity, and Scott will certainly get into that, and Frank will talk about some of our initiatives within this. One thing that I do want to stress without taking too much time is the importance of data collecting. This is really in our 50-year history, our first opportunity to really collect a lot of data from the cultural sector. So we really want to encourage you to participate actively and encourage your peers to participate in filling out and providing as much data that we ask for as possible. This will go towards reporting back to the legislators and to the governor's office just exactly how much impact we have had and will continue to have. And it also helps us to advocate for future funding. This is the funding I mentioned earlier is $20 million in year one and 10.7 in year two. And we really want to move the needle on a number of our initiatives. So this is our opportunity to be transformative. It's an exciting time. I'm glad that you're all here. I think we can all collectively do some great work together. So I'll turn it back to Scott, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason was just saying, the strategic plan really put a focus on looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and access throughout the organization, and for our granting program in particular. And as a result of that, our application review committee, which is chaired by Frank, met over the summer and began to look at the strategic plan, the work that we're doing with equity, and our funding priority language. And with that, I will turn it over to Frank to kind of explain some of that work and the new priorities that resulted.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Jason. And thanks for that reminder of the great turn of fortunes for CTH this past spring. And thank you all for all that you guys did over the spring to make that possible. And shout out to folks who were part of our EDI training in the spring as well. It's definitely been that support that's helped us get to this point, this really exciting point. And as Jason noted, a lot of our assessment predates the pandemic. We were already thinking about our history and our granting practices, the things that were pretty perfect and the things that were not so perfect. And the pandemic just pushed us to think about them with more urgency. Can't talk about that time without shouting out how well the staff did at pivoting and pushing out a ton of money to the sector before we had extra help and extra hands on deck. So when the histories are written of this period, there will be a special line for the work that Scott did and the work that Jason did and everyone else did in that office, because they were incredible and we all owe them this incredible debt of gratitude. And as many of you know, who attended the equity training, we had this time to think more about the ways in which we're pushing money out there and who we're reaching and who we aren't reaching. And the board was certainly invested in those conversations too. And as Jason noted, realized it was an important time to make sure that the funding priorities and other practices across the organization were aligned with the kinds of discussions we were having at the board level and amongst the staff. So as Scott noted, we got together as ARC. And for those of you that don't know, ARC is made up of folks just like you. Any one of you could be on ARC if you wanted to. So a little pitch there. Folks working in the field who come together regularly to review applications from organizations throughout the field. We sat down and looked at the funding priorities and did our best to bring them into alignment with the kinds of conversations we're having with our IDEA task force and with others throughout the sector. And Amrit, you can definitely throw those priorities up anytime now. Yeah, and we think that they really nicely reflect changes that we're seeing in the work that people are doing, that you are doing out there in your institutions, things that we want to see happening, things we want to support, and things that we want to move toward. And as Jason noted, in this upcoming grant request, there will be lots of ways to message some of the things that we hope we'll see and to reinforce and acknowledge the work that folks are already doing along these themes and lines that have been discussed for the past year, at least at CTH. I'm not going to read them to you because they're up now, you can see them. But I will ask Scott if he wants to jump in and add anything to this sort of description. And I'll note that ARC did the work to think this through. ARC, which is a body of folks just like you, just like folks on the call, we did send it back to the board for a rigorous discussion of what we thought we needed to do and why we needed to do it. And there was broad agreement in what we presented. So it was in some ways a really perfect process of thinkers doing the work, coming up with the changes that we needed, and then discussion with leadership and staff to figure out what really worked, and then approval after all that. And it's the way we want to keep working. And it's definitely informed by what we see in the field and what we hear from folks like you, and how we bring that back to the board for final decisions. And I will stop there. Scott?
Thank you, Frank. And what you see here, I don't think many of you will see as dramatically different from what we had previous. So I'm going to point out a couple of key areas here to hone in on it and let you know that the page we're looking at here is going to be evolving and growing as we move on as well. So at the top of this page here, we've always had the priority of having significant humanities scholarship overarching the different projects that we support, and that remains. But we have added here some of that inclusion, diversity, and equity language here to make sure that the projects that we're funding really want people to be thinking about ways of having their exhibits, their public programs, their humanities activities be told those stories in an inclusive, diverse, and equitable way. Some of the funding priorities are almost unchanged in language. By that, the advancing creativity and demonstrating ingenuity and innovation, pretty much the same as was before. Some, we found a better way of saying it, like contemporary issues. We've always wanted the projects that we support to help us understand the issues that are going on in our communities, in the state, in the nation, or in the world today. And if there are ways that our discussions or our exhibits are helping us understand issues like gun violence in America, immigration reform, whatever that key topic is, the pandemic that's happening, that's a priority for us in making decisions where our funding goes. One that's completely brand new is presenting accessible content that provokes, challenges, educates, and inspires. And that, I don't know if there's anything you want to say here, Frank, about that and that discussion with the committee, but we really wanted to try to find projects that reach the audience and are at a level that is accessible to whoever is listening, but at the end of the day, leaves us in a different place than where we came in. And hopefully we've learned something, or we're being inspired to go out into the world and make a change. Frank's nodding.
I'm nodding, yeah. So that's the big dreaming one. So balancing the stuff that has to be done with the stuff that's a reach or that's visionary. And we wanted to hold on to one of those. So this is the one that gives space for that.
And then the other one that's new, but I don't think is new in terms of what we've been saying over the past months and years with the granting program, is that if we create a project that has a way of living on and continuing to connect with people after the project proper is done, whether that become an exhibit, having a virtual life afterwards, or having content that will live on in a digital project like our ConnecticutHistory.org, or you're doing a public program that you're going to record and can be accessible on YouTube or some other way, that's where that fourth funding priority comes in, access to content after the length of the grant, and then our funds and the content in the discussion that happens can live on as a priority for us. As always, no organization should try to create a project that hits every single one of these priorities. And in your grant applications that you're articulating that you're doing it all, it's more important to hit one or two successfully and find ways of articulating that. This is not to say if you find a project of yours that doesn't seem to fit into any of those that we wouldn't fund it. But at the end of the day, if we're down to $100 left to spend and we need to try to figure out where that funding should go for one or more very worthy topics, this will help guide our committee in making those decisions about where projects should be funded and where the funding might run out. And as I said, this is going to be a dynamic page and one where we're going to start to link to examples in a variety of different ways. So for one example here, that last bullet point, which is one I haven't talked about, fostering collaboration among organization groups and communities, there's a couple different projects that we've recently funded that I think that speak to this well, that I want to work with the organizations and communities that are doing that. But two examples that come to mind, I know some of these people I'm actually seeing on the call today, in Ridgefield, the library, the Historical Society, Keeler Tavern, the League of Women Voters, other organizations have come together for a few different projects in a row now to look at topics. They're currently exploring the First Amendment. They looked at women's suffrage. They're coming up with a community-wide suite of programs that are happening across multiple institutions, rather than those same institutions doing their same programming blocks on completely different topics and in conflict with one another. They're really looking at things holistically as a community. And that's one example of something that nicely meets that. Or in the southeastern part of the state, the One Book, One Region, which has been going on for a number of years, where they take a book and they look at it and have discussions at libraries, a big kickoff event in June, culminating in the author coming to the region, doing some programming and having a large author talk at Connecticut College. And it's a first year reading assignment for all college students. Again, a nice way of having a bunch of organizations working together on a topic, a theme, an issue together. So more on this page. And at the end, happy to answer any questions that you have about this. But I think we can take off the screen share and go back to the Brady Bunch. Thanks, Amorous. I'm sure a number of you are excited to know about our funding priorities. I imagine many more of you are wanting to know about the money and when it will come and how it will come. So that's what I want to kind of transition into now and talk about two funding priorities that will be coming in short order, and then quickly get it over to the Q&A for you all. Timing wise, it's looking like now the first opportunity that's going to go live will be those operating support grants with State of Connecticut funds that Jason was talking about. Again, this is a partnership with the state in the Office of the Arts. We met for, I think it was 3 hours with Liz Shapiro on Friday to go over a number of these questions, issues, and eligibility. So let me kind of go over an overview of how this program is going to be looking like right now, and then go over a timeline of how it will start to roll out, and you'll see it, and when the funds will be starting to hit organizations. Again, this is funds that came from the state of Connecticut. These are the $20 million this year and the $10.7 million next year that Jason was mentioning. Of that, the funding requirements are that 80% of that needs to go out in general operating support. So we're looking at about $16 million this year and $8 million next year. I mean, these are numbers that are staggering to talk about. Before the pandemic, we were granting about $850,000 a fiscal year at Connecticut Humanities. With the pandemic, we got up to about 2.9 million in calendar year 2020, which was exponential. And now we're looking like with this and some of the other funding we'll be talking about in a moment, we're going to be in the neighborhood of $21-22 million going out in this fiscal year that runs July 1 to June 30 for us. If you are an organization that is eligible, you will receive funding. It is not a question of you're competing with someone else. If you are a museum, and I'm talking all types of museums, children's, history, art, you name it, historical society, historic site, arts organization, performing arts organization, presenting arts organization, arts center, you will be eligible for this funding. It's basically all humanities, arts, and cultural serving organizations. The minimum award that we were talking about last week and that we're expecting to go into the guidelines is $5,000. So no matter how small you are, you will, at a minimum, have an award of $5,000. That award will go up based on a number of factors that we're still working on right now, but it will largely be about your operating budget, both the operating expenses that you have and the operating revenues that you have in a year. And to do that, we're going to ask for data for the current year that you guys are all operating in. And I know some operate in calendar years, some operate along with the states, July 1 to June 30. Doesn't matter. Your current year and the 3 most recently completed years worth of data is what we're going to be looking at. And that's largely going to help right size the awards to the institutions. That said, there will be a cap. So the largest places, the cap we're looking at is going to be $500,000, which is a huge amount of operating support in itself. Although if you are one of the largest organizations in the state, there's never enough operating support to go around, and we realize that. We want to right size the awards and try to be equitable in distribution and not have the largest organizations take up the vast majority of these funds here. That's the current plan for who's going to be getting the money and how it will be distributed in dollar amounts. The timeline that we're looking at right now is that we will hopefully be able to get these applications live within the next 2 weeks. I'm very nearly done with the draft. We need to, again, work with the Office of the Arts to make sure that the questions are right and that we're all in agreement about the data we're collecting. The applications will potentially have a couple different deadlines, or at least a large swath of time to open, probably mid-November. November 15th is what I'm currently working with here for when the applications will be due. And it will be a quick turnaround after that. We want to get these awards decided and calls made to organizations before Christmas, and at least have places know what their funding level will be before the calendar turns. It will probably take us a little while longer to get contracts all squared away and funds out, and that probably will happen in January. But the goal right now is to be able to let people know before 2022 how much funding they're going to be getting this fiscal year. We will work with Amherst and the Connecticut League once the application and guidelines are finished and people have a chance to start looking at these, to gather again the answer questions, because we know there's going to be questions. We're partnering with the Office of the Arts, with the direct regional service organizations, the local arts agencies across the state. I'm hoping that we can set up some information and conversations regionally as well. Our goal is to find every eligible organization, have them submit an application so we can get them funding. And as Jason said, we're expecting in the neighborhood of 500, 600, maybe as many as 700 organizations applying. And if you are eligible, like I said, you will receive funding. So at the end of the day, how do you know if you're eligible if you do some of these things? For those of you that are arts organizations, the qualifier that we're talking about right now will be familiar to you, which will be that the language in your mission statement talking about what it is that your organization does. Are you doing arts, humanities, cultural activities? And then a percentage is at least 51% of your activities, arts, humanities, cultural type stuff. And that's going to be a determining factor as well for eligibility. I know there's going to be a lot of questions, so I think I'm going to kind of cap it there for this with one last caveat. There will be questions that we'll need to have to be able to right size the awards. And as Jason said, there will be some data gathering questions at the end, and we'll make it clear that these are questions that the responses will not be used to influence your award amount. But we're looking at this as an important opportunity to capture data from the field to know how many cultural organizations we have. Right now, there's various estimates. This will be probably the most accurate number of cultural organizations that have ever been created in the state. And then to find data on number of employees, audience served, diversity and equity and inclusion numbers for our field that we can start to report back on and share with the state and help to drive future advocacy for funding to go on. In many ways, this is a 2-year period of prove it for the state. And we want this funding to continue. So we need to find ways of showing not only where we were as a sector before this funding came out, but what this funding allowed us to do as a sector and how we can move the needle. And to that, there were 3 areas that Jason really worked on with the state that were priorities. One, staffing. The state is interested in making sure that our sector, if it lost jobs because of the pandemic, we're hoping to bring them back. If people lost hours, to give them new hours. If we can add new jobs onto places to help deal with the unemployment in the state, that's a priority for the state, and a hope that this operating support will help with employment. A second area is K-12 education. As many of you know, and why we did the Kids Free Summer Museum program, which I know a number of you participated in, there's been an equity issue and an educational gap because of the pandemic, remote access, hybrid learning, and it's a priority of the governor and of the state to find ways of helping our cultural community fill that gap and assist K-12 educators in sharing our state's stories and history with students and with educators. And then the third is in bridging the digital divide here and improving our digital access, access to content online for the public, for the K-12 educators, and to help improve our state's access to strong digital content. I'm going to stop there, move on to the NEH funds. And I know we got questions, and I see them come up in the chat, and we'll make sure to answer all your questions, but I want to try to do this in the next 10 minutes to try to stay on schedule here. The other grants that we're going to be offering here, and they will go live second, are the funds that we received from the National Endowment for the Humanities from the last American Recovery Plan, the last omnibus federal support bill. Last year, we launched CARES Act grants. I know a number of you applied, many of you received the funding. That was largely general operating support last year. Because of the aforementioned funding from the state, we are not going to use the NEH funds as operating support. There is no good way for us to determine which organizations deserve 2 shots of operating support and one which only deserve 1. That's not an equitable way of doing things here. So instead, we're going to make these project-based grants that will be in competition in some ways with one another. But we have a large pot of money. We have $640,000 to disperse. We are making the maximum award amount for these grants, which we're calling SHARP grants, S-H-A-R-P, supporting humanities organizations through the American Recovery Plan. And those SHARP grants will have a maximum award of $10,000. So we'll be able to do up to 64 max awards of $10,000 each. These are going to be largely, for lack of a better way of describing them, capacity grants. Grants to help an organization improve its capacity moving forward because of the pandemic and where we've been so far. But we're going to look at that capacity writ large, and we're going to come up with some ways of articulating what we think these grants can and should do, but it is not going to be a finite list. If you have other ideas of project ideas to run by us, we're happy to receive them. But It could be staffing as well, to say that because of the pandemic, you reduced somebody's hours or laid off some staff, and you want to bring them back. Or with this additional funds, we'll be able to hire our first 10-hour-a-week position at an all-volunteer organization, which will allow us to better serve the public coming out of COVID moving forward. So something along with that. You have to connect whatever the project is back to covering your organization or better serving your community because of the pandemic. It could be contractor-led projects, doing strategic planning to give your organization the right path to take for the next 3 years coming out of the pandemic, or hiring someone to do an audience assessment and survey to figure out what your community is really looking for your organization at this time. Or it could be investing in digital infrastructure and buying hardware and software and giving your staff the training, knowing that your community is really looking for a lot of digital these days and you just don't have what you need to be able to serve the public in those ways. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about with capacity in relation to those grants. Those grants I'm expecting will come out probably now mid-October. They're also going to have probably a mid-November deadline. So the deadlines are going to be somewhat similar, I think, at this point for ARP and for state funds. And again, we want to adjudicate these and get awards out by Christmas. So Frank, our application review committee, has done yeoman's work, and they continue to do yeoman's work. He applauded the staff. I want to applaud him and the people on ARC. They're looking at hundreds of applications in very short periods of time and right-sizing decisions that we can go back as a staff and articulate, many cases with happy news, but even to those that don't get funding with feedback that will be understood and make sense at the end of the day. I don't know about you, but I'm sick of hearing my own voice here. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to let Amherst start to lead the Q&A with us here and start to get at your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott, Leanne, Jason, and Frank for laying all of that out for us. So we have a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. So I'll address those first, and then we can open things up to a more general conversation. So Anne asks, if we received funding from the Connecticut Office of the Arts for supporting arts organizations, would we also be eligible for this new operating funding?
The answer that we discussed last week would be yes. So if you receive most any source of funds, you will still be eligible. The one exception is if you receive like a line item in the state budget that gives you a direct line of support as an earmark line item in the state budget, that likely will be taken into consideration, and your award might end up being reduced based on the formula that the state will spit out. Very much like with Kids Free, it was formula based. We took a bunch of number points to get an equitable award, and that might reduce somebody's award. But no, your SAP support, which in many cases is very small and is in the few $1,000s range for organizations, will not impact your ability to get a Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support grant, nor would receipt of any federal funds, NEH, NEA, IMLS, whether you got an SVOG, shuttered venues funding. None of those federal grant lines are going to impact it. Doesn't matter if you got Kids Free funding, a CARES Act grant from us last year, none of those. We're trying to only have things be equitable here. So this is basically from the state, from that pot of money this year, which the most comparable thing that would be a conflict would be those that already got a direct line item appropriation from the state.
Great, thanks, Scott. Faye asks, how do these new SHARP grants differ from existing QUIC grants?
Okay, very good question. So QUIC grants are really project-based presentation grants that you're doing for the community. So you want to run an exhibition, you want to do an author talk, those kinds of things. The SHARP grants are capacity for the organization. So it's not something that you're going to be getting funding for to do something humanities specific for the public. It's how can we help improve your organization's capacity to better serve the public because of where we are in the pandemic. And whether that's staffing, getting a consultant to give you some data that will help you run with give you software or hardware that will enable you to do many better humanities projects like that going forward. There is some overlap with our capacity grant line, which we will still be offering, which has November and April deadlines. That's the closest comparable for our core grant lines. But the federal funds, those SHARP grants, will allow you to kind of do all the things that our normal capacity grants would do and then some. You can have a quick grant with us and still apply for all the funding we're talking about today. There's no, if you already have a quick grant, you're locked out. So this will be in addition to, not, in competition with funds that you already have or our core grant lines.
Great. Kathleen has her hand up. Kathleen, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, I raised my hand, Scott, and then you answered the question. So I'll turn my question into a shout out for everybody. Yeah, our big concern has been the fact that we, and I'm sure a lot of people sitting in these boxes, were not eligible for the shuttered venues or save, our stages grant. So we've been sucking wind, and I don't know if anybody else is up in the middle of the night panicking. So this is an enormous relief certainly for the Barnum and everybody on this thing. So I want to thank you guys for all the hard work, Frank, all the work trying to figure this out, because it is a lifeline to our industry sector. And I, for one, am enormously grateful for the unyielding effort to make this equitable for everybody. So my question is now just a big old thank you.
Well, thank you.
I would love to, this is Terry with the Avon Historical Society. I'd like to say the same thing, because when I first heard or read that you were getting some of this funding, my first thought was you could do so much good by making sure everybody gets a little piece of it, because we in the community, in volunteer organizations, can leverage $5,000 to make it 10 or 15 if we were just given it. But sometimes there's so many hurdles and we don't have staff to do these things. So it's great that you give it to the big organizations, but the little ones who can do really small stuff, but on a big scale, we just appreciate that. So I have to say thank you very much, because that was going to be a note to you all. If I didn't hear that today, I was going to write you all and say, please, please, please don't forget us, because that we do things, in Avon, we're doing a lot of things. We partner with a lot of organizations. And I do have a very big one coming at you sometime soon on the whole Paleo-Indian piece. And there's going to be a lot to that. So I'm really happy to hear that you're going to share with everybody so we can all have a part in this. And thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you to Kathy and to Terry for the kind words. Just know, and sometimes you're not often involved in the behind the scenes conversations that take place. And there's been all kinds of pots of money that have come from the federal government and from the state government. And we're always trying to figure out the ways to most equitably distribute and have the most number of organizations be eligible. At the end of the day, sometimes politics and decisions and priorities for certain grant lines do mean that we have to cut some places off. Those decisions are not made lightly, and they are talked about. And they're talked about again often in many cases. But for this case, the goal really is we want to try to hit as many places as possible, get funding to as many places as possible to be as equitable. And like we said, end up with some great data, not just at the outset, but over the course of 1 year and then 2 years worth of support. Obviously, the funding gets cut in half based on the state numbers for next year, but there will be operating support grants for next year as well. And how we can start articulating to the state what this is doing and moving the needle in tourism, audience served, K-12 education, and really the greater good for the state.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And thanks for the shout outs. I think the league really shares that desire to, get this stuff out there to as many organizations as possible. And we're going to be working closely with Connecticut Humanities to keep you all updated on what's going on. I think to go back to what Jason was talking about earlier, this idea that we have this sort of we have a couple of years to really show what we can do in the field in Connecticut with this infusion of funds. And I think we're all going to be working together to demonstrate that, this money is money well spent in Connecticut, in our communities, and on the work that we all do. So, we're all pulling together in the same direction, and I think it's a really exciting time.
And to that, Amherst, let me just say one more thing before we take the next question. We're going to continue to roll out resources over the course of 2 years, not just the funding to help you do that. So that might be workshops and trainings that either Amherst and the league roll out. We roll out and work with the direct regional service organizations on a regional level. I've had a couple of conversations with audience evaluators, and we want to get some people to really help us gather the right data and create data collection tools for you all as well that you can be rolling out at your sites, so we can get uniform data on key points that we can be reporting out on together. And that might require some training as well. And we'll do the training regarding that. So it's not just funding, there will be other support that will be coming for organizations as well. Oh, you're on mute,
I
Amherst.
muted myself again. Marjorie just had a quick question about what the first grants coming from the state funds, what you're calling those.
So we settled on Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support grants. There's no great acronym, but Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support grants. And they'll have operating support grants right in the title everywhere we put it to make clear for you all. The second set of grants will be the SHARP grants, and those will be the capacity grants with federal funds.
Great, thank you. I think Sam, you're next.
Thank you. I have two questions. One has to do with, Scott, you mentioned that when it comes to submitting an application for the operation support, you would want to have the current budget year as well as 3 previous years. And I wondered if you could characterize how detailed those reports would be, because of course, you know, the current year is no problem. Maybe last year is not too bad either, but you know, you get into the history, and for one, we've changed our chart of accounts a little bit, and it gets a little tricky to do that. And I have another question about the funding of digital infrastructure. You mentioned that under the SHARP grants. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about that, whether or not that would include not just purchase of equipment, but installation of it. And I think you also mentioned training. Of course, that's a big part of that whole thing. So those are my 2 questions, if you could, please.
Sam, great questions here, and I'll try my best to answer both of them here. So the first one, number one, we don't want any of the data collection points here, whether they be things that are going to help with the award or some of the optional stuff where we're trying to just get good uniform data on the field, to be impediments to filling out the applications. And the worst thing would be that you want to say, I'm not going to fill out the application. I'm going to give up money because I don't want to fill out the application. So at the end of the day, let us know. We're going to work with you guys because we want to get the funding out there and not create stone walls. That said, you know, there's going to be a couple of key data points that we will call out. One of which I know will be the total amount of operating expenses that an organization had in each of those years, and then the total amount of operating revenue or income that you had in that year. So we can start to see, is the field as a whole, you know, breaking even? Is the field as a whole running an operating deficit? Has it gotten worse with the pandemic and the pandemic related years? How much of a sector do we lose financially from 2018 to where we are right now? So that's why we're asking for some of that data. There will be an upload of a budget that should have at least operating expenses and operating revenues, whether you give us a 1-pager that's got category kind of summarized staffing, programmatic, buildings and maintenance level, consolidation, or you're giving us line item details, or you're giving us, you know, board audited financials, because that's the easiest thing to pull and you can just give it for the right year there. I think, you know, you give us the data that will get us the bare minimum stuff as accurately as possible without causing undue stress. That's our goal, and we can work more with you offline on those questions as they come up. To your second question, there will be some category caps. I've got like 30 pages of guidelines that we got from the National Endowment for the Humanities for administering these funds on their behalf. And again, I don't have it in front of me. I think there will be a hardware purchase percentage cap on award, which I can't remember. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, 30, 40%, something like that. So you would need to know if you were buying hardware that we don't exceed that percentage that were mandated by the federal government not to exceed. But beyond that, it could go towards basically what would be honoraria for people to come in and do the installation. And if you have outsourced IT services, to pay for those outsourced IT services, or if you have a staff member whose work is dedicated to this stuff, to pay a portion of their salary and cover that, or for trainings, whether that be for the whole staff or just a subset of staff. So I think even if we're doing a technology grant and there's going to be a percentage cap that the federal government is imposing on us, there will be a lot of other expenses that we can pick up.
It's 20% for equipment.
20%, Leanne did the check, 20% equipment mandated by the NEH.
Great, thanks. I think that'll be welcome news to a lot of organizations out there because I think this is something that many of us are thinking about. So it's good to hear some specific examples of what that might look like in terms of sort of building the digital infrastructure at organizations around the state, not just through things like Connecticut Collections and the CTDA, but what organizations are capable of in-house. Yeah, go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
I was just going to say one thing here. While we have not launched those Sharp applications and I haven't even started building it out yet, the core base of that is live. So I want to try to have the questions about your project be as close to our existing capacity grant applications as possible, and those are live. So you can go on our website, look at capacity grants. If anything, it'll be less material about the project we're asking for, not more. Where there'd be more, there might be some specific things I need to ask because of the ARP funds and the information that the federal government is asking for. But in terms of describing your project and what those questions will look like and the amounts, use our capacity grant line as a rough estimate right now of trying to get information together as you start to sketch out your projects. And hopefully we can have those be as similar as possible.
Great, and I can pop that link in the chat when we move on to the next question. There was just a comment from Faye saying that the collaboration between the Office of the Arts and Connecticut Humanities is a really great sign and an excellent model for advancing these kinds of cultural activities. So there's a lot of goodwill coming in over the chat here. Thank yous for all this information. And
it's really it's unprecedented. I mean, and this goes a lot of credit really to Liz Shapiro at the Office of the Arts and Jason Mancini here at Connecticut Humanities. They've established a really strong working relationship. And back to the founding of the two endowments, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts, back in the 1960s, for over 50 years now, it's created a bifurcated system of arts funding going to states in one way and humanities funding going to a state in another way. And we're really talking more about the differences in the arts and the humanities to figure out where you go for support rather than the ways that the arts and humanities work together. And that's the way the public sees us. That's been a compelling argument for funding and for a lot of the funding that you've seen coming out from the state of Connecticut, and that these aren't two disparate worlds, that these are worlds that work together. And it's led to the increased funding that we have today, and hopefully will lead to the increased funding that we'll see going forward.
Hooray, there's just lots of goodwill coming in. So Maisa says, I congratulate you on identifying the impediments smaller organizations face when applying for much needed grants and then minimizing them. So kudos. Thanks, thank you. Helpful and inspiring, so grateful. So I think that there's a lot of joy at what is coming on here. And it looks like Candy's got a question. So why don't you unmute yourself and ask it, please?
Yes, I'm on the bandwagon of it's well overdue that the Connecticut Office of the Arts and the Humanities have gotten together, because those are the two worlds I work in, and it's been very difficult to get them to communicate with each other through the years, and to finally, go up that mountain and be there. I cannot tell you how happy that makes me. My question is one that Scott and everyone is really familiar with. For those of us who are independent program creators and producers who work with a variety of different partners, how are we going to shake out in all of this grant if you are not a not-for-profit entity and of yourself? Obviously, partnerships with not-for-profits are there, but are there going to be any opportunities for those of us who are independents who want to create historical, cultural diversity programming, and we would like to offer it to a variety of different organizations, not just partner with one, but with a variety of them? Is there anything coming down the pipe that will help us create these programs and then offer it to the widest variety of entities, organizations, and cultural presenting houses?
I'm going to speak to that, and Jason, you can give thumbs up if my answer is sufficient, or if there's anything else you want to say on this front here. The way I look at it is the $16 million that's being infused into the economy here will have homes first and foremost as pass-throughs with the cultural organizations that are eligible to apply. That will start to have ripple effects throughout the sector in the hiring and the contracting and the programming and the activities that start to roll out at cultural sites. They are going to have up to $16 million of funding that they never expected to do things. This will have the job market be hopping. I expect the Connecticut League's job board to like quadruple in size here as people start to hire people, and then those start to cause ripple effects of new job postings to open up. And as these places start to figure out how they want to serve their communities, you know, Candy, to your question specifically here, they're going to be doing more activities than they were able to do previously because they're able to cover someone's salary with these new funds, and then that opens up other funds that had been budgeted that they can do programmatic activities with, or vice versa. So I think you're going to be an indirect beneficiary of these funds, even if we can't directly grant to you based on the way these funds have been awarded. Jason's giving the thumbs up. Okay, he agreed.
I would maybe just offer, in addition to that, we would really like to encourage arts organizations to find pathways to humanities voices, and humanities organizations finding outlets with arts organizations within our Connecticut communities.
And we'll talk more about that going forward, but that has been conversations that we've been having with Liz in the Office of the Arts. We would love historic sites to find ways of, and you're a great example of this, presenting history and culture through ways that reach different audiences and different learning styles, with performance, with song. And on the flip side, if you are an arts organization and presenting, to find ways of partnering with and collaborating with the historians, the scholars, the historical societies in your town to frame that conversation and provide context in ways that you might not have done previously. And we think that there are really a number of organizations that do this well, and many others that we'd like to find encouragement to try to branch out and try things in the other arenas.
Great. And Steph Burr from the Northwest Connecticut Arts Council adds that individuals also have the opportunity to get program funding through the Connecticut Office of the Arts Artist Respond grants. So those might be something else for those of you in Candy's vote to check out and look into as well. I just as a public service announcement, Sam had a question about where to find the recording of this. This will be up on our YouTube channel as soon as I can upload it, hopefully this afternoon. I'll send an email to everybody who registered with the link as well. And I think Connecticut Humanities will also be posting it on their website. So you'll be able to get it and find it in many ways, because I'm sure you may want to watch this again or share it with colleagues in the field who weren't able to be here. And Frank sort of gives that thumbs up on arts councils and regional service organizations have additional funding to share with individual artists as well. I think that takes me through the questions that I have seen come up in the chat. We have about 4 more minutes left. If anyone has any additional follow-up questions about the grants, the funding priorities, anything else.
Or Jason or Frank, if there's anything else you'd like to share now that you kind of heard how that conversation went, and
Indeed.
Parting words for folks.
There was a question from Myron that we haven't answered that came directly to us. That was about whether or not we can use these funds as matching for other CTH grants.
All right. So if you didn't hear that, there was a matching funds question that we got. You cannot match any of our grants with any of our other grants. So if you want to allocate funding towards salary and you have a Connecticut Humanities grant that you need to match and you're matching with salary, you need to be separating those two in some way and not be using the same hour of somebody's time, both with our funds and then as a match somewhere else. However, can match state funds with NEH funds or NEH funds with state funds. So if you have a SHARP grant from us and you want to use that as match with some other state grant that is not from us, that would be allowable. If you got a project grant from us and you end up getting larger federal funds, you could match that with that. You just can't match any source of CTH funds with a different CTH funds grant.
Great. Thank you for that explanation, Scott. And thank you, Leanne. I had seen Myron's hand up and then it went away. So I assume the question had been answered. So thank you for catching that for me. We have 2 more questions that have come in. So we'll get to those 2. And then I think we'll close things out for today because we're getting close to 1. Let's see. First, Diane asks, will arts regional organizations be eligible themselves as well as helping to get the word out to their constituents about these funding opportunities?
Yes.
The DRSOs will all be getting operating support as well. We're working with Liz Shapiro to get that squared away.
We talked about whether it would be a separate application or it would be this application. And we settled on, rather than having all these applications we have to create, just having the DRSOs fill out the same application that you'll be working with your constituencies on to access the funds.
Great. And there was while we're still on that match question, Kathy just wanted a clarification on that. The general operating support grants need to be matched or not?
No.
Okay. Yeah, she wanted to just
not
clarify that. Great. That's important to know. Lastly, we have a question from Sarah. Will there be some sort of repository for institutions that want to or are looking to partner?
I think that we can figure out, I'm not sure exactly, I understand, Sarah, if you're on and you want to kind of clarify a little bit more there. I mean, we're going to find ways of sharing partner projects through best practices when it comes to our funding priorities. In terms of applications here, I'm not envisioning we're going to have a repository, but we can always do matchmaking and find ways of helping to connect organizations. But if that's not the answer to your question, Sarah, and you want to, and you're still here, elaborate, please do.
Yeah, we're, I took that, I don't want to put words in Sarah's mouth, but I understood that as, organizations that in thinking about your new funding priorities, encouraging those sorts of community partnerships that, if you're an organization, you have an idea, but you don't know who would be good to partner with. Yeah, it's sort of like speed dating for grant applicants. I could think, Erin is suggesting a CLHO matchmaking Zoom. We could certainly do a colleague circle where you bring your project and do that.
Frank likes that too.
Yeah, it was definitely, I didn't know I would become a matchmaker when I was getting a PhD in history, but here I am. But I think there are ways that both Connecticut Humanities and the League can help facilitate that if you get in touch with us, because we often hear about things that are going on. So we can do it in that informal way of, hey, we've got this project idea. Do you know anyone else who's working on this or who would be good to talk to? And I think, Scott and Leanne and I are probably all, I don't want to volunteer your time, but I'm certainly happy to, get your emails and see what I can do in terms of working the phone lines or whatever.
I don't consider myself to be a repository, but I guess in many ways I am the repository. So for those of you who have done grant consults with us, we're always trying to say, okay, so you need to be aware of this other organization, this scholar, this other project we funded that connects back to what you're doing. Recommend checking in with them, being aware of what they're doing and finding if there's ways to collaborate. So we always do that when we counsel, and we will continue to do that.
Great. Well, we're getting some thumbs up and a lot of excitement about this. So that's a great question, Sarah. Thank you for that. I think that's a good place to end with the idea that we will get back together to talk about all the great ideas that we have. Again, thank you so much for being here. Thanks especially to Scott, Leanne, Jason, and Frank for sharing all this information with us, and for the hard work that you've been doing on behalf of our sector. You know, as someone who also, like many of you, receives funding from Connecticut Humanities, we're really grateful for the work that you do to support us here in Connecticut, and to advocate for the field. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you again soon at another colleague circle.
And we're going to stop the recording and people can feel free to leave, but I can hang around for a few minutes if people had questions that weren't answered or you didn't want answered on the recording.
Great. Thank you all. Have a
Thanks,
good
everyone.
afternoon.